Greetings, Lumen students. It is week 13. This is your Tuesday video. Here I am in front of an ancient medieval mill because two of the characters in Good Master's Sweet Ladies their story involves this mill. So we're going to talk about them in just a minute. Before I get started with them, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the feudal system, how it works during the medieval time period. So of course we knew the king kind of was the top and the center of government, but then he awarded lands to nobles and lords that were in his favor in return for them paying him taxes and supplying knights to go on crusades and fight wars for him. So the government system really did revolve around this lord, and he would live in his castle or in his manor house, and then the peasants would farm the land and live in the village that surrounded the castle. The Lord was in charge of everything. He controlled who had lands, what land they were given. He could punish them for crimes. He was the judge, the jury. Whatever happened on his land, he could make decisions about it. He had absolute power. He could hold court, do whatever he wanted to do. The Lord would then swear his oath of loyalty to the king, and kings believed that they had the right to rule, and they were given that right by God. Peasants, of course, had a much harder time. About 90% of the people worked the land as peasants during this time period. They worked hard and they died young. Most were dead before they reached 30 years old. Okay? So worked long days, 6 days a week, and often barely had enough food to survive. And so in that village there would be a church, there would be a mill, and the mill was also controlled by the Lord. And when people would come to get their flour ground at the mill, they would have to give a percentage of their flour to the Lord. We read, if you remember, about Mog, who waited at the mill, who was forced to wait at the mill for 8 hours. She had to get her flour ground there, and she had to give the Lord his share of the flour, unless it's broken for a day and a night. So the mill owner was not always very popular, because the mill owner was kind of seen more connected with the Lord and part of the Lord's service. Something else that made them unpopular was that the diet of medieval peasants composed mostly of just bread. Okay, that's all they would eat a lot of the time. And if the miller was dishonest, the peasants had less to eat and no way to fight back, since grinding grain at home was against the law. They couldn't grind their own grain. They had to grind it all at the mill. Here's just some flour. We're so used to just seeing it like this, and we make cookies and other things with it. We don't realize that it comes from wheat kernels and then has to be ground at a place like this. So we're going to read the story of Otho, who was the miller's son. Father is the miller, as his father was of old, and I shall be the miller when my father's flesh is cold. I know the family business. It's been drummed into my head, how to cheat the hungry customer and earn my daily bread. Oh, God makes the water, and the water makes the river, and the river turns the mill wheel, and the wheel goes on forever. Every man's a cheater, and so every man is fed, for we feed upon each other when we seek our daily bread. My father is a hard man, muscular and stout. He swings a heavy cudgel whenever he walks out. My grandfather was like him, a man of gain and sin. They found him in the mill pond with his skull bashed in. Oh, God makes the water, and the water makes the river, and the river turns the mill wheel, and the wheel goes on forever. I used to wonder why the peasants hated us so strong. They think we pick their pockets, and they're not far wrong. Flour in the flour sack, vermin in the flour, peasants waiting by the mill hour after hour. They curse us as they stand in line, enjoy their little talk. My father grinds their flour and replaces it with chalk. Oh, God makes the water, and the water makes the river, and the river turns the mill wheel, and the wheel goes on forever. When you think about the matter, it's as good as any sermon, for the villains feed the miller, and the miller feeds the vermin. When I was only 4 years old, still babyish and unsteady, I tried to play with common folk, but they hated me already. They knew I was my father's son, and my father serves the Lord. One day I'll show them hating me is something they can't afford. Oh, God makes the water, and the water makes the river, and the river turns the mill wheel, and the wheel runs on forever. There's no use in looking back, for here's the truth I found. It's hunger, want, and wickedness that makes the world go round. For every man's a sinner, and he wants his neighbor's grain. The peasant moves the boundary stone and steals the Lord's domain. The miller steals the flour, and the baker steals the bread. We're hypocrites and liars, and we all get fed. Half the world's a thieving, and the other half's a crawling. The mouth of hell is gaping wide, and all of us are falling. The judgment day is close at hand. The hellfires are a-burning. There's no way to retrace our steps. The mill wheel's still a-turning. For God made the water, and the water makes the river, and the river turns the mill wheel, and the wheel goes on forever. My father used to beat me sore. I've learned that life is grim, and someday I will have a son, and God help him. Does that sound like the kind of life that you might want, students? To be hated so much by the other peasants, to feel like all of the world is cheating each other and dishonest, and there's nothing you can do about it. So one of the ways that they would cheat, the peasants, was to mix the flour, right, the white, fine, powdery flour, with chalk dust. Ugh. And so they could keep back more of the wheat for themselves, more of the flour for themselves, and the peasants couldn't do anything about it. Well, they killed his grandpa with his skull was bashed in. Not too good, right? Well, Otto shouldn't look at the world in such negative terms, because Jack is going to do and treat him a little bit differently. If you remember Jack, he is Mog's little brother, and he is called names because his father beat him so much. He's not kind of all there. He's not. He is called the half-wit, which is kind of a cruel term for someone who maybe isn't as smart. And for Jack, probably because he's received some brain damage from the abuse of his father. So he's going to begin by telling you some of the other names that he has been called. Jack the half-wit, lack-a-wit, numbskull, mooncalf, fool. That's what they call me. That's what they yell in the village when I walk through. I don't say back. I'm waiting till I get big and I can hit hard. My sister Mog says, don't listen to them. You're no fool. Can't you milk the eggs and milk the cow and gather the eggs? And I can. I can milk as well as anyone. And I can always find the eggs more in Mog. I watch the hens. I see where they go. Father used to say I was good for nothing else. But Father died and we don't miss him. Now it's just Moggy and me, and Mother and the beast, which is good. Heaven must be like this. Jesus and his mother, and the dumb beasts and the angels fluttering around like birds. Nobody drunk, nobody yelling or hitting or jeering lack-a-wit, just friends. I have a friend. Moggy doesn't know. She hates him. Otho, the miller's son, She says he's a thief, but I never saw him steal. They hate him too, the other boys. When they see him, they whisper and snicker, and they throw rocks at him. One day last winter, I was hunting the eggs, and he was under the hedge, crouched down, crying. His nose was all bloody, his eyes turned black. He turned his back so I wouldn't see, but his shoulders were shaking so hard. I knew what to do because of Father. There was still ice under the trees, and I clawed up a handful, and I laid it against his face gently. And I said what Mog always says, "It'll get better. It'll get better. It'll get better." He made a noise like a bull being slaughtered, and I cried too. I told him he could have my eggs, all 3. He didn't answer, just kept making that noise, his mouth open so he could breathe, his face all bloody, and tears and snot. I stayed by his side till he stopped. After that day, he's been my friend. He doesn't speak, he doesn't smile. But he hasn't forgotten, because he never joins in when the other boys shout, "Lack a wit, numbskull, mooncalf, fool." So Jack did something nice for Otho when he'd been hurt and beaten by the other boys. And so now Otho doesn't make fun of Jack either. I don't know if I would call them friends exactly. Now I want to tell you one last story, students. This is one of my favorites from this book. It's about Nellie, the sniggler. Guess what snigglers are? You are not going to believe this. A sniggler is a person who catches eels by dangling bait into their holes in the riverbank. Okay. Frogs and eels were desirable sources of protein during the Middle Ages. So I told you all they eat is a lot of bread, and see the river going by the mill, and so a sniggler would be reaching down into that water and trying to catch an eel so that they could eat that or a frog and get a little extra protein. Okay. Nellie has an interesting story, and it involves a bucket. Okay, so I want you to think about this bucket for a minute while I read. I was born lucky. Nay, not born lucky, as usual here, but lucky soon after and ever after. My father and mother were starving poor, and they dreaded another mouth to feed. When my father saw I was a girl child, he took me up to drown in a bucket of water. But here's the lucky part, and it's pure truth. I didn't drown, babe though I was. I took hold with my wee fingers and held to the side of the bucket. My mother wept, and my father's heart went soft, and he could no more drown me than himself. And they named me Nellie for Queen Eleanor. Okay. How sad is that? Okay. And it is not fiction. It's based on a true story. Newborn babies have strong fingers and an instinct to hold on. The story about a baby catching hold of a bucket in which her father meant to drown her is true. The original plucky newborn was a woman named Leifberga who lived around 700 AD. And my parents' luck changed. First, my uncle died of the scurvy, and we got his pigs. Then the nuns at the abbey hired us to catch eels, and we've been sniggling ever since. Do you see these eels? Fresher than the day they were born and fat as priests. I know where their burrows are, and I know what they like for bait. And as for frogs, I've been catching frogs since I was 2 years old, and there's not a frog in Christendom jumps fast enough to get away from me. I can swim as fast as any boy, and better than Drogo, the tanner. Do you know Drogo, the tanner's apprentice? I can point him out to you because he'd see me. He's always staring at me. Many's the time I've seen him peel off his hose to show me his legs, as if every frog I've ever put into a pie didn't have better legs than his. We had a brawl last summer. I said 'twas the fault of the tanners that the river stank, and he said 'twas the fishmongers, which is pure folly. 'Tis surely God's will that fish should rot in the water, but the beast should rot on the land. I put up my tongue, and by St. Peter he pushed me right off the wharf into the water. And then, poor fool, he thought I would drown. I, who couldn't drown when I was just 3 hours old. He splashed in after me, and I dove down deep and grabbed his foot, and I ducked him 3 times, and it serves him right. Only then I had to drag him out of the water, because it turns out he can't swim. So I suppose you could say I saved his life. He's never forgotten it. He watches me all the time and shows off his legs, but I don't speak to him. I want nothing to do with him and his legs. I pretend I don't even know his name. And every day I walk past the tannery just so he can see me not looking his way. All right, students. We will continue reading some more stories from Good Masters and Sweet Ladies as we continue on our history stories. But I thought you might enjoy those too. There was one more thing I wanted to tell you about, and that is the 3-field system. So the 3-field system was typical of farming during the Middle Ages. Landowners knew that if they sowed the same crop in the same field year after year, the harvest would be poor. So each year, one field was allowed to lie fallow, and they wouldn't plant anything on it. They would just let it rest. And the other 2 would be planted with a crop different from the one planted there the year before. So like most peasants would own strips of land in all 3 of the village fields. This made sense in many ways. The labor of working a field that required a lot of plowing was shared, as was the harvest from a fertile field. It also meant that no peasant had all of his land in the fallow field, which would have resulted in starvation every 3rd year. But the drawback of the system was that the peasants had no control over where their strips of land would be. The lord of the manor was in charge of this decision, and he generally chose the best land for himself. So peasants would suffer if their strips of land were far apart, because hours of precious daylight were wasted as they zigzagged from field to field. We'll learn about some more of the characters in that book as we continue our history studies. Little students, I want to remind you, you're working on a Story Jumper picture book about one of these medieval characters, whether it's a knight participating in a crusade, someone going on a pilgrimage to an area with saints' relics or bones to view, or a special place where a miracle happened. You can also do a story about a child on a crusade themselves. You can do a story about a peasant being afflicted by the Black Plague, which we'll be learning more about. So enjoy making your own picture book about this time period, and we will catch you next in our video on Wednesday. Thank you.